Now, boss fights are generally designed to be challenging skill checks which test the player's worthiness to continue onward, but these fights, well, they were straight up sadistic, leaving us all foaming with impotent rage as we hit the continue button once more. But thankfully, there is some light at the end of this painful tunnel of beatdowns. I still don't know why I walked through there on my way home, and that's Corey McDiarmid's suggestion that I picked from last week's episode to be a full-fledged entry here. And if you want to be a part of next week's video, then have a think about what you pick as your favourite video game weapon that you only had one chance to get, and likely missed. But for now, let's resume beating our heads against the wall, but in this case, the wall is tougher than tough bosses that made everyone rage. Oh dear. Number 10. Kai Leng, Mass Effect 3. Because Mass Effect 3's wet fart of an ending wasn't infuriating enough, the game's climactic boss fight with the easy-to-loathe assassin Kai Leng was a bewildering mix of boring and annoying. After losing to Leng in a fight earlier on in the game, players were excited for the rematch, basically just to put this smug cyber chode well in his place. But the resulting battle is both obnoxious and painfully low effort. Where defending against his close-quarter attacks is pretty tough, and if you try to take the fight to range, he'll just send some mighty goons your way. The tedium of downing Leng's regenerating shields in order to deal damage to him makes this a maddening snoozer of a boss fight that also happens to be frustratingly tricky depending on your build. It is truly the worst of both worlds, irritating to get through and flatly disappointing as a payoff to Leng's utterly detestable presence throughout the entire game. Number 9. Zoran, Uncharted 2, Among Thieves. Even accepting that the earlier Uncharted games had an exhausting commitment to never-ending combat, you'll struggle to find many defenders of Uncharted 2's blood pressure spiking final boss fight. The climactic clash against villain Zoran forces you into a clunkily designed arena to do battle with a guy who relentlessly chases you around, tosses grenades in your lap, and then takes aim right at your face with his shotgun. Weakening him with the explosive blue pustules littered around the map is an utter chore, to say nothing of how awkwardly ill-suited the controls and camera feel for such an encounter. If you are balmy enough to play this game on crushing difficulty, the boss fight is legitimately sanity-eroding stuff, enough so that it might even leave a permanent blemish on your feelings about an otherwise brilliant game. We love you, Naughty Dog, but Uncharted really doesn't need boss fights, and definitely not ones like this. Number 8. Taron Malicus, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Now, many were left surprised by just how challenging Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order ended up being, and there's no better example of this than the hellacious boss fight against the corrupt, dual lightsaber-wielding Jedi Master, or former Jedi Master, Taron. Basically, if you've barely parried in the game leading up to this point, you are gonna have a bad time, because parrying is necessary to counter his tough-to-read flurry of attacks. Even so, it's no picnic otherwise. He is an intense and imposing opponent whose attack patterns are tough to avoid, to the extent that it borders on cheapness at times. Finally, felling him is a euphoric feeling for sure, but for many it's a tricky boss fight that could have desperately used some fine-tuning to feel a little more fair. Do yourself a favour, and if you're playing this game for the first time, acquaint yourself with parrying early on to avoid this headache with him later. Number 7. Lingering Will, Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix. And so we come to Corey McDiarmid's suggestion, and honestly gang, I won't lie to you here, reading the name Lingering Will after years of active and relentless repression in my mind was like being punched through the screen in my still healing hernia scar. Corey, myself, and thousands of other players can rightly state that we hate this boss, as it doesn't so much act like a brick wall to your progression, especially seeing as this is an optional boss, but presents itself like a final test, except here all the teachers are tutting at everything you write, you're having rubbers thrown at your head, pencil sharpenings blown into your eyes, and you're being tasked with writing a sequel to the theory of relativity in under 10 minutes. Oh, and you're naked. I challenge anyone to put up their hand and say that this boss battle was fun, as it is an agonising slog of pattern memorisation, insta-kill combos, and so much artificial difficulty here that it reeks of a developer just wanting to take the utter piss. The fact that he can pull off so many ultimate near-screen filling moves one after another is enough to make your blood fizzy, and to die when getting their health down to reasonable levels only to go through it all again will make you want to spit in Goofy's face. And I love Goofy.
So beautiful.
Number 6. Vitalis, A Plague Tale Innocence. Now, even accepting that everyone expects a final boss to be the challenging summation of everything leading up to it, A Plague Tale Innocence final boss frickin' stinks, mate. Given that the bulk of the game is a relatively straightforward and not too difficult stealth romp, it was a pretty unpleasant surprise for the final boss against Vitalis to devolve into a more generic phase-based affair that also happens to be frustratingly clunky to boot. This is a chaotic boss fight of the worst kind, less an exciting plate-spinning challenge and more of a stamina-sapping exercise in pattern recognition as you try to avoid being hit by the army of white rats in front of you. A big part of the problem is that this game clearly didn't need a final boss fight at all. Something so blatantly gamey feels incredibly out of place coming at the end of such a richly cinematic adventure. This is backed up by the sheer number of players online who reported not even finishing the game because of this boss fight. Instead, they just watched the ending on YouTube. That is what we call a rage quit, my friends. Number 5. Paul Serene, Quantum Break. All at once, let's say it loudly and proudly, absolutely f*** off, Paul Serene. The final boss of Remedy's sci-fi actioner Quantum Break isn't merely a difficulty spike, he is a difficulty obelisk, so unforgiving that he basically ruins the entire game. Throughout the fight, Serene will lob explosive energy balls at you while you fight his rabble of monarch mooks. Oh, and he'll also send a giant red wave after you, which insta-kills you on contact. Cheers, mate, thanks, thought we were mates. Between all of this, you need to try and actually harm the guy until he finally perishes, but considering the brutal lack of checkpoints in such a demanding battle and how the pre-fight save point is placed before the cutscene, nobody could blame you for bouncing off before then. There are tough boss fights, and then there are those that clearly weren't sufficiently QA'd before release, because this Paul Serene fight is straight up contemptuous of players. Number 4. King Dice, Cuphead. Now, unlike Paul Serene, Cuphead's King Dice was an incredible boss fight in spite of its rage-inducing nightmare, but that didn't make it any less maddening while you were playing it. The genius of the King Dice fight is that it's a mini-boss rush, a gauntlet in which players must battle up to 10 different mini-bosses, and then finally King Dice himself. Each of the fights offers up its own unique degree of challenge, and as with the rest of the game, it is absolutely beautiful to look at, somewhat softening the blow of its rather intense difficulty. While the individual mini-bosses generally aren't amongst the game's toughest challenges, collectively they do form a demanding ask of the player given the lack of checkpointing. Sure, if you learn how to time your dice rolls, you can skip a large number of these bosses, but that is certainly easier said than done. Number 3. Senator Armstrong, Metal Gear Rising, Revengeance. The single hardest boss fight in the Metal Gear franchise just so happens to be from that goofy spin-off Hideo Kojima only had minimal involvement in. That's right, it's time to talk about Metal Gear Rising, Revengeance. The final boss fight against the unexpectedly yoked Senator Armstrong is a downright piss take, a 30-minute endurance trial in which Armstrong hits hard and throws up some seriously sturdy defenses. The window to make a dent on him are almost hilariously thin, and it only gets worse at the halfway point where he reveals that he's powered by, let's just say it together, nanomachines, son. It's a boss fight that tests every facet of the player's accrued skill over the course of the game, and requires far more of the player's reflexes than any other fight in the series. Though finally ripping Armstrong's still beating heart out of his chest is tremendously satisfying, you'll feel like you've aged a few years by the time it's all over. Number 2. The Black Hand of Sauron, Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor. Now, to be clear, the final boss fight against the Black Hand in Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor didn't leave people raging because it was brain-breakingly difficult, but instead it was because it was one of the most woefully missed opportunities in video game history. Shadow of Mordor is, for the most part, a thoroughly entertaining game defined by its fluid combat and innovative nemesis system. And so the prospect of battling the big bad tin hat man over here, or rather his adjacent lackey, within the gameplay framework, well, that was tremendously appealing. What's this? Oh, just we're dealing with him in a QTE sequence instead. Cool. That's what the fans want, right? This dog water boss fight requires nothing more than a few button inputs from the player, just barely stopping short of flashing up a neon signpost which reads, "Oh, sorry mate, we ran out of time." It remains one of the most biblically anticlimactic final boss fights in video game history, one so stupefying that it actively dented the game's overall reception. And number 1, Ishin the Sword Saint, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. And finally, of course, we had to include at least one From Software game, and though there's no real consensus on the toughest Soulsborne fight, and say it with me kids, of all time, Sekiro's Ishin the Sword Saint is definitely a damn mighty contender. This battle is perhaps the all-timer instance of a game requiring you to demonstrate all of your learned skills in tandem, given that each phase sees him switch up his attacks and requires a different answer to the problems he's presenting, right up in your face. Very hard and deadly. But before you even initiate the 3-phase duel with the Saint himself, you've got to deal with the pre-fight boss, Genichiro, and every time you fail, you'll need to battle him again, and again, and again, because yeah, this is going to happen a lot. He hits hard, fast, and doesn't offer up many tells for what he's going to do next, and this makes him the peak of hard as balls boss fights, sure to leave a vein throbbing out of your forehead as you try to fell him for the 50th time in the row. Though considering that the PS4 trophy data has only 28% of players actually defeating the final boss here, you're probably in the majority of bailing on him altogether. And there we go, my friends, those were 10 boss battles that made everybody rage. I hope that you enjoyed that, and let me know what you thought about it down in the comment section below, and also put your suggestion for next week's episode. Have a think about what you pick as your favourite video game weapon that you only had one chance to get. As always, I've been Jules. You can go follow me over on my social medias, where I'm over on Blue Sky at RetroJ, but the O is a 0. Yes, I am making the move, my friends. Goodbye. But before I go, I just want to say one thing. Hope that you're treating yourself well, because even though we spoke today about video game bosses that made us rage, we don't want to be carrying anger forwards with our day-to-day. We want to be going forward with love and happiness in our hearts for ourselves and our neighbour. So be kind to yourself. Let go of anger if you have the capacity to do so. And if you're struggling with it, please speak to someone. Friends, family, professionals in the sport industry, anyone. Try and share your problems, because trust me, it usually solves them a lot quicker. Take care of yourself, all right? As always, I've been Jules. You have been awesome. Never forget that. I'll speak to you soon. Bye.